Hello, in this video, we are going to discuss federalism. Prior to watching this video, please complete the video quiz for a more perfect union because I'll be referring to that video. I'm going to keep this video short since the video quiz was a little longer than most. So, the big three that I wanted you to remember about the Constitution. Remember? Empowers government, limits government, and anything against the Constitution is void, ain't never happens. Okay? So, when we talk about giving power to the government, one of the things that you learned from the video was that there was this pull of how much power that each government should have, state governments versus the federal governments. In fact, the state governments actually had their constitutions prior to us having our US Constitution because we were set up as individual states under the Articles of Confederation. So then we have this big deal of how much power, and it's always this pull, and it's a pull that exists today. The concept of federalism is that we have two governments, and the two governments have powers individually, and then they have powers that overlap. And so federalism addresses that. For example, we have national powers and the national powers of the government, we're going to talk about this more in chapter 3, the federal government, come from the Constitution itself, what they can do. And then the state has the police powers to do everything else that is not outlined. But the state also has some shared powers. They can do some of the shared things. For example, they're so nice. They both tax us. We get to have state and federal taxes. Some of our laws are both state and federal. Okay. But what happens if we have a state law that gets in the way of a federal law or a state law that conflicts with federal law? Well, that's what we call the supremacy clause. The supremacy clause in the Constitution says, it tells us, the founding fathers said, hey, this is what it is. The Constitution, this Constitution, and the laws of the United States, which will be made in pursuance thereof. Well, the laws of the United States made according to the Constitution are the supreme law. The Constitution is going to be first because the laws you make have to be made in pursuance of the Constitution. And all treaties are the supreme law of the land. What does that mean? That means federal law always trumps state law. We call it federal preemption if there's conflict between those areas of law. So let me say this. Let's say the federal government decided to pass a statute to protect food coloring for some reason. I'm just coming up with this crazy. And so you cannot discriminate against food coloring. And the state says, we are not going to let anybody, we don't like blue. We're a red state, we don't like blue, so we're not going to let anybody color their food blue. But the federal law says you can't discriminate against blue food coloring. That federal law is going to preempt state law if the federal law is constitutional and the federal government has a right to make that law. What they have a right to make, we're going to learn about. But what you need to get the gist of this is that federal law is supposed to trump state law. Okay, and we said that from the beginning. But here is the kicker. What we will learn is that federal law had a list of enumerated, which we call listed things that they could make law on. And it has expanded and expanded and expanded over time. So federal law, basically, the federal government can make any law they want almost. I'll explain why when we do chapter 3, because we have a necessary and proper clause and the commerce clause. But the federal government basically finds a way through the Constitution to make a law, so they're always going to have more power and more control over the states. So the debate and the struggle between the federal government is still alive today. It's very relevant. Let's talk about the 14th Amendment briefly. It was passed to address, to prevent basically to prevent and to correct some of the things that happened after the Civil War. And there was a section of the 14th Amendment, particularly, that was there to address those who had participated in the Confederacy or supported the rebellion. And some of you, if you've listened to the news, have heard about Section 3. And Section 3 basically says there is a list of people who have taken an oath, and if they've done that and engaged in insurrection or rebellion, whether or not they should, then they should be prevented from being part of office again. Colorado has determined that this applies to former President Trump and have taken him off the ballot. Now, there's a lot of other issues, whether this applies to the president or whether or not how it should be occurring. One of the main arguments that former President Trump has is that it specifically states that but Congress may by a vote of 2/3 of each house remove such disability, which would seem to infer that it is up to Congress to determine whether or not this should be triggered, not the states. Additionally, Section 5 of the 14th Amendment, and we'll talk about the other sections that are relevant in another slide, but this is just relevant to that portion of the amendment, says the Congress shall have the power to enforce by appropriate legislation the provisions of this article. So it clearly states in the amendment that, hey, it's Congress that has the power. But obviously then there is a debate of whether the states have a right to choose who they want to put on their ballot or not. And if it's a requirement of the Constitution, is it the federal government or the state government that takes action? So this is just one way that it kind of acts today as something that we're juggling all the time, the states versus the federal government. So I want you to think about something. Let's think, does the federal government really have more power than was contemplated by the founders? It seems like they have a lot of power today. They can do a lot of laws. They can make a lot of decisions. And then think, does it matter? Does it really matter what was contemplated by the founders or even what the founders cared about, as long as we're applying it to today? And is our system really working today? These are things I want you to think about as we go through this unit. So that's the end of the discussion for today. The next discussion, we're going to talk about the purpose of law and where the sources of our law come from. And that is also going to be intertwined with the Constitution and some of these other concepts. So we'll see you then.